Richard Branson, From Student to Virgin Empire, a story of dyslexia, determination, and daring dreams. Beginning and background. In the quiet suburbs of Surrey, England in 1950, a baby boy was born into a world of privilege that he would later learn to question. Richard Branson entered the world as the son of Ted and Eve Branson, two people who would profoundly shape not just his character, but his entire philosophy of life. His father was a barrister, a man of the law and logic. His mother was a former dancer, a woman of spirit and adventure. Richard would inherit both their natures, but it was his mother's fearless approach to life that would become the compass guiding his extraordinary journey. The Branson household was one of comfort and security. Their home was spacious, their circumstances stable, and their future seemingly mapped out. Richard had everything a child could want: a loving family, financial security, and the promise of a traditional English upbringing. Yet, from the very beginning, something was different about young Richard. While other children seemed to effortlessly absorb the lessons their teachers offered, Richard struggled. The letters danced on the page, numbers refused to obey. What he later learned was dyslexia, a condition that would shape his entire worldview, was presenting itself as an invisible barrier between him and the conventional path that awaited him. But his parents, particularly his mother Eve, refused to see Richard's struggles as limitations. Instead, they saw them as opportunities to build character, resilience, and creative thinking. This perspective, that challenges could be transformed into strengths, became Richard's first and most valuable inheritance. It was a gift wrapped not in gold, but in wisdom. Childhood and education. The Branson children, Richard and his younger sisters Lindy and Claire, grew up in an environment where independence was not just encouraged, it was expected. Eve Branson was an unconventional mother by 1950 standards. She believed that children should be challenged, pushed beyond their comfort zones, and taught to solve problems rather than avoid them. When Richard was 4 years old, his mother stopped the car a few miles from their home and told him to find his way back. A child, alone on country roads, navigating by instinct and observation. Most parents would call this neglect. Eve called it education. These weren't acts of carelessness, but deliberate lessons in self-reliance. Richard would later recall these moments not with resentment, but with gratitude. They taught him that the world wasn't there to serve him, that he had to engage with it, understand it, and ultimately change it through his own efforts. These early experiences created in Richard something that no school could teach: an unshakable belief that he could figure things out, that obstacles were merely puzzles waiting to be solved. But school itself was a different kind of challenge. At Skatecliff School, a preparatory boarding school, Richard's dyslexia became impossible to ignore. While his classmates raced through their lessons, absorbing information from textbooks as easily as breathing, Richard struggled. The land numbers in mathematics twisted and reformed in his mind. The words in literature seemed to shift before his eyes. The experience was isolating and deeply frustrating. Teachers, operating within the rigid educational system of post-war England, often interpreted his difficulties as laziness or stupidity. Some were sympathetic, many were not. By the time Richard reached Stowe School, one of England's most prestigious independent schools, he had developed a coping mechanism. He learned to listen carefully, to ask questions, and to compensate for his reading difficulties through sheer force of personality and memory. He wasn't the brightest student in the classroom by traditional measures, but he was becoming something perhaps more valuable. He was becoming an observer of people. He watched how people communicated, what motivated them, how to make them laugh, and how to inspire them. These skills, honed in the halls of his boarding school, would become the foundation of his future empire. Yet the pressure was immense. England's education system in the 1960s was designed to produce a very specific type of person: well-educated, well-mannered, well-suited to a career in law, medicine, banking, or the civil service. Richard didn't fit the mold. His headmaster, recognizing both his potential and his struggles, once told him, "Branson, you will either go to prison or become a millionaire." It was meant as a warning, but Richard heard it as a challenge. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a spark was igniting, a determination not to follow the path laid out for him, but to create his own. First struggles and early failures. After leaving Stowe School, Richard was at a crossroads. University seemed the logical next step, but it didn't feel like his path. His father, ever pragmatic, suggested a career in the military or law. These were the respectable routes for young men of his class, but Richard had other ideas. At 16, he told his headmaster he wanted to leave school and travel. The headmaster's response was to tell him he'd be nothing without an education. Richard had the audacity to disagree. What followed was a period of uncertainty that would characterize much of Richard's early adult life. He drifted between different interests, starting a few small ventures that quickly fizzled. There was no grand master plan, no clear vision of the empire he would eventually build. Instead, there was just a young man trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted to contribute to the world. This period, often glossed over in triumphant narratives, was filled with doubt, failure, and the very real possibility that he might prove his headmaster right. Then came the idea that would change everything, a magazine called Student. He was just 19 years old, a young man with minimal business experience and no formal training in journalism or publishing, but he had something that many seasoned business people lacked. He had energy, optimism, and the willingness to learn by doing. He gathered a group of friends and launched the magazine in 1966, operating from a basement in London. The goal was ambitious: create a magazine that would speak to young people, that would tackle real issues facing his generation, and that would do it with style and substance. The early days of Student were chaotic and filled with setbacks. They had almost no money. Richard had to personally approach advertisers to keep the publication afloat. There were weeks when he wasn't sure if they'd be able to print the next issue. He made mistakes, naive ones that any experienced publisher would have avoided. But these failures became his education. Every rejection from an advertiser taught him something about sales. Every missed deadline taught him about project management. Every critical letter from a reader taught him about his audience. Around this same time, Richard also faced personal struggles that tested his resilience in different ways. The fashion and culture industry of London in the 1960s was vibrant, but also unpredictable. Young entrepreneurs were celebrated one day and forgotten the next. Richard had to develop thick skin and an unwavering belief in his vision, even when the world around him seemed indifferent to his efforts. His peers were heading to universities and beginning prestigious careers. Richard was in a basement, eating bad food, sleeping little, and battling constant self-doubt. But something remarkable was happening. Richard was learning the most important lesson of his life: that business wasn't about following rules, it was about understanding people and creating value for them. Student magazine began to gain traction. It wasn't an overnight success, but it was growing. Celebrities started to take it seriously. Young people were buying it because it spoke to them in a way that mainstream media didn't. Richard had created something real. Motivation and turning point. The turning point came not from external validation, but from within. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of hawking advertisements and dealing with the endless mechanical problems of running a magazine, Richard had a conversation with his mother that would reshape his entire approach to business and life. Eve Branson asked him a simple but profound question. "Richard, what are you really trying to do?" Richard paused. He realized that beneath all the daily hustle, beneath the failures and the financial struggles, he was trying to do something that mattered. He wanted to create a voice for a generation that felt unheard. He wanted to prove that business could be about more than just making money. It could be about making a difference. This conversation with his mother sparked something. It wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration, but a slow-burning realization that would guide all his future decisions. The purpose of business was to solve problems and improve people's lives. Everything else, profit, growth, success, would naturally follow if you focused on serving people better than anyone else. This same time, Richard was introduced to an opportunity that seemed completely removed from magazine publishing. An entrepreneur named Freddie Laker was creating an airline that would offer low-cost transatlantic flights, challenging the monopoly of the major carriers. When Laker's airline eventually faced difficulties and routes became available, something clicked in Richard's mind. An airline was just another service business. If he could understand people and create something valuable for them, why couldn't it be in the aviation industry? This was the moment when Richard's ambition transformed from small and contained to boundless. He wasn't just thinking about magazines anymore. He was thinking about industries, about markets, about the potential to disrupt established businesses by focusing on what customers actually wanted, rather than what the industry told them they should want. The decision to start an airline, Virgin